This video is part one of our discussion of Silver Linings Playbook, directed by David O. Russell. And the film is based on the best-selling novel of the same title by Matthew Quick. What we're going to be paying close attention to in this film is a couple of different tracks. Number one, we want to look at how bipolar disorder is being presented to us in film, because it's a relative rarity to have bipolar disorder presented in film at all. We also, though, want to look at the medium of the romantic comedy, because that's essentially what category this film is in. It's also, a family drama in addition to being a rom-com. So we need to look at all of those layers as we simultaneously are looking at whether overall this film is a net positive or a net negative or kind of neutral in terms of stigma messaging. Before we dive into the details of the film, Haslam, who was writing in the online magazine The Conversation in 2013, stated, and I tend to agree, that exaggerated cinematic portrayals of mental illness have largely stepped beside bipolar disorder and instead have focused their attention on other illnesses, particularly schizophrenia. The idea that people experience both manic and depressive episodes, you would think that that would be an interest for filmmakers and for writers of story. However, it has not been the case that filmmakers have frequently gone to this topic. I can count pretty much on two hands, under 10 films that I've considered using for this class that make a direct claim that the main character is a person with bipolar disorder. Some of those films are quite bad. Some are quite good. Most are kind of in the middle. Silver Linings Playbook is an entertaining film with A-list stars and a high-quality director who was really fond of improvisation and giving his actors the freedom to explore their characters more fully. So in that sense, this is an enjoyable medium for us to explore the issues. Skip Young, who wrote a book that I often pull articles from for this class called Psychology of the Movies, wrote about Silver Linings Playbook that it's an excellent example of a film that at once is fairly accurate about a number of elements related to mental health, is misleading about other elements, and yet ultimately is true to its own artistic vision, benefiting the author in the end. And I think we can look to that statement that Dr. Young has made as being a good assessment of where this film stands. It's really great on some points in terms of accuracy, which isn't surprising because David O. Russell, the director, his son, who was at the time in his late teens, is diagnosed with bipolar disorder. So he has some familiarity with the experience of it as a parent of someone who has struggled. So going back to Dr. Young's comments, he says that in terms of accuracy, what's most accurate are those family dynamics, which again isn't surprising given David O. Russell's position as a father who has dealt with many of the really thorny issues of having a young adult living with bipolar in his home. On the other hand, however, when you look at realism in terms of psychiatric diagnoses and treatments, the film, has lots of inaccuracies. So it is fiction, but from our standpoint, what our job is here in this class, we do need to take that into consideration. And finally, Dr. Young notes that the portrayal of the psychiatrist, Dr. Patel, is very problematic. So we're going to explore all of those elements as we go through our coverage of the film. So to start, I wanted to give you a little bit more background on David O. Russell's take on the film, as well as the lead actor in the film, as well as Robert De Niro. So I'll give that.
It was beautiful for my son to be the guy who had to be, and not this guy. He had to be the other guy. And I just want to tell a very funny story. Is that one of his big scenes when Mr. De Niro chased him, which we just saw, in the middle of his bipolar episode with Bradley, really, it's such a stellar performance, an amazing performance, where he's having that breakdown about missing his wife. Anyway, Matthew rings the doorbell, and De Niro chases him in his pajamas. And the first take, Matthew just like starts laughing hysterically. And I said, "What are you doing? This is serious, you know?" And he said, "Oh my God, it's like I was in Raging Bull." He said, because he doesn't tell you what he's going to do. He's so in the moment. He didn't tell us that scene you saw where he cried. That was not scripted. That was not directed. I never asked for it. I never even had a conversation about it. We were just so grateful. You asked him if he was intimidated to work with him. He said, no, he's comfortable. I was very intimidated to work with him. Because I just have so much respect for the man. He set the tone for the whole set. But he just did it. And we were shocked. We were like, oh my God, Robert De Niro's crying in the scene. And so, we asked him to do it one or two more times, And he obliged. But so anyway, so Bob comes out and pushing him. And I said, you can't do that. He said, but it's like I'm in Raging Bull and it's freaking me out. And eventually he said, you know what? It's real. A teenage kid, if a grown man with a bloody nose in his pajamas was pushing him, might start to laugh nervously. So let's play it. And that became a very beautiful moment in the film where he says, I'm going to come back here, I'm going to break that camera over your head, but I'm going to come back and interview what it's like to have that camera broken through. What are you laughing at? I'm sorry. And he immediately realizes that he's out of control, but he gets to say, what are you laughing at? And so he used it. He taught us all.
Did you feel a greater responsibility about doing a film that David had so much personally invested in?
Oh, of course. I mean, I understand what he... I don't like to get emotional, but I know exactly what he was doing.
You understood some of the same experiences that he's had with his son. So clearly this became an important cathartic experience for all of you, a communal experience.
I mean, when I first showed him the screenplay in his home, we all know people who face these challenges, and we've all been touched by these people, and we love these people. And as he says in the movie, I want to do everything I can to help you get back on your feet. And there's nothing harder in life than when you can't figure out what to do. You try everything, and you must never stop. Your heart just has to keep growing. But when I first was in his apartment and I was talking to him about the screenplay, this is what happened. And I thought he was having hay fever, and I realized he was having an emotional reaction. I sat there and I watched Robert De Niro cry for 10 minutes, and I said, wow, he's really connecting with this material, and this would be a beautiful thing if it could work out, because I think his heart would be there, and it is there.
So I think that gives you a context for where David O. Russell was coming from in his approach to the film, given his own experience with his son Matthew. But then you also have that connection from Robert De Niro's point of view. Robert De Niro is notoriously private, and he has never really disclosed who he was thinking about with that strong emotional reaction. But what's clear in the performance is that he understands where David O. Russell was coming from and how he wanted to present the characters of Pat Jr. and Pat Sr. In the film. So when we need to start out by kind of just laying out the territory of how the story arc is started for you. So what's going on in Pat's life at the beginning of the film is he's getting out of a psychiatric facility where you're told in bits and pieces he has been hospitalized, ordered there by the courts after a violent altercation with his wife's lover, where the incident, as it's described, and if you ever have a chance to read the novel, it is simply called The Incident on more than one occasion. So the incident is that he nearly beat the man to death, and the man was a co-worker, another teacher in their atmosphere, and he loses control and nearly kills the man. You also meet Pat's mother and his friend as he is departing the hospital. And it's kind of suggested that his ability to get out of the hospital is contingent on his being in a stable home environment with his parents, and that he be under some degree of supervision such that he will remain compliant with his treatment plan. Otherwise, he will need to go back. So what you're on notice to look for right away in the presentation is, or in the film rather, is what are some signs that he's not really okay, or that he's relatively unstable. And you do see some early signs of that. He appears to be obsessive about exercise. He appears to be not particularly rational in his beliefs about the possibility of him getting back together with his wife. For instance, his obsessive exercising and his the supposed physical transformation into a very fit, very attractive man is going to win her back. And the idea that he will obsessively read all her books. She's an English teacher, so he'll go through the entire syllabus and read all the books and show her that he's really trying, and therefore he'll be able to win her back. So he seems fairly irrational about those things. He also routinely seems agitated and anxious and nervous, some of which could be attributed to his mental illness, but also just, being 40-something and having to move back home with his parents could also account for that as well. Now, when I asked you the question, what kind of things seem to upset Pat the most during his adjustment period? So he's, think about, what would it be like if you were a full-fledged adult, you've spent some time incarcerated, essentially, and now you're out, but you're living essentially like you were, in your late teens in high school, back in your parents' home. So there are a number of things that are upsetting to Pat that would be upsetting to anyone who was in that same kind of situation. But how his parents respond is this mixture of not just, irritation at the demands Pat might make, but also their fear that his symptoms are getting once again out of control. So the plan that Pat has made now that he's out of the hospital is this fairly delusional plan that he's going to read all of his wife's curriculum. He's going to read all of these classic novels. He's going to learn the material so he can be a better partner to her. He's worked out. He's got his physical shape back, and he is going to be the best husband ever. Now, everyone around him knows that this is irrational. He gets upset when he notices that his pictures with his wife are no longer in his parents' house. He gets upset when he can't find the wedding video, and a variety of other things like that. So when he arrives at the house, you start to see some of the dynamics within their home. And I will pause to say that Bradley Cooper is from Philadelphia, and the film is set in Philadelphia. And Bradley Cooper's mother came in and gave Jackie Weaver, who plays his mother, gave her dialogue advice on how to sound like a native Philadelphian. And Bradley Cooper's uncle came on set and coached Robert De Niro in dialect and kind of how to do this persistently shouty, loud, working class kind of banter that was used in the film. But you get that sense of what their family dynamic is. Mom is trying to be the peacemaker, the mediator, to often insert herself physically in between these two men who are so much bigger than she is, but she is able to calm them, keep them stable and centered, and try and make everything okay. So she's presented to you, the mom figure, as the person who has to deal with these two very volatile men. So right away, you get a sense that, maybe there's some kind of familial transmission of this violent temper issue. What you learn fairly early on is that De Niro's character, despite being a rather rabid Eagles fan, he is not permitted, he is banned from the stadium. He's not allowed to go to games. The assumption you're led to make is that he's attacked people and gotten into fights, so he's no longer allowed. So what does that suggest to you? Remember, one of our stigma components is contagion or transmissibility. So the writers there are suggesting to you that the fact that his father, Pat Sr., has this volatility to him, it may mean that Pat Jr. has acquired some of those attributes from his father. Now, his obsession with getting back in touch with his ex-wife, who he still refers to as his wife, he wants a letter to be delivered. And after he is introduced to Tiffany, she becomes kind of the conduit for delivering this letter. So she kind of starts participating in his delusional belief that if he can just articulate himself clearly, that he can win his wife back. In many ways, his desire to do this, his desire to reconnect with his wife, is stretching the bounds of rationality. As it unfolds, as the story unfolds, you learn that she is settled into a new life. It's kind of communicated to you that she's married, she has another home, she has moved on, but Pat has not. And he's really attached to this idea that he can get her back. So that indicates the possibility of a delusional attachment that is perhaps, given that you're given the anchor of bipolar disorder, it is perhaps a manifestation of a hypomanic or manic episode. Now, going into a little more of the dynamic with Pat's parents, Mom and Dad don't always agree on having Pat at home. You get the sense that Dad did not want Pat at home yet, or perhaps at all, whereas Mom wanted him out of the hospital as soon as possible so that she could help him. At the same time, both of them appear to really love their son. They love Pat, they want the best for him. But I've seen this in a lot of families where you have an adult child with a serious mental illness. There's this kind of PTSD-like experience of having been through the trauma of someone's episodes over the years and being constantly on guard, being a bit hovery, and in some ways controlling. So, they have adopted this stance that kind of feels like they are viewing him as if he is still an adolescent as opposed to an adult. So he's in that never land of living in his parents' home as a pseudo-adult, but is not being given any of the kind of freedoms of adulthood. So like they want him to be home. They don't give him a phone. I mean, he has no source of income, so he's entirely dependent on them for his survival at this point. His dad wants to wrap him back into probably what they always did when he was very young in their home, which was be a fan of football and other sports, be kind of rah-rah about the Eagles and excited about those things. So in a way, he wants to wrap Pat back into this relatively safe lifestyle of sports fandom, so that he can keep him close and keep him out of trouble and keep him safe. Now that ends part one of our conversation. When I come back in part two, where I'll be heading is moving in the direction of talking about more of the accurate components that we see in the way the film is constructed and how it's shot.